Hi, this is Kathleen. My presentation this week is called Intro to Television Pedagogy in the 21st Century. As you know, I'm working on a television class, so I'll talk about some of the things I've read. The first was an article by Jonathan Nichols Pathak from DePauw University in Indiana. His article was entitled Going with the Flow on the Value of Randomness, Flexibility, and Getting Students In on the Conversation. That's a picture of him there. And one of the main things that he did was talk a lot about how in television, things are changing so fast, as I've mentioned before in a lot of the articles I'm reading, and teachers are finding that when they walk into the classroom on any given day, things have changed. There's new things going viral, there are new things happening in the industry, and a lot of times students will come up with new things they want to talk about. That are relevant to things that they've already been talking about in class, or new questions that they might have. Hey, what about this new group or this new website or this new thing? And so being flexible and able to work that kind of flexibility into your curriculum is really important. And we in the industry, we talk a lot about the network era, the post-network era, which is pretty much anything since 1980, but he is defining the neo-network era, which means all of this convergence and things that's happening, not just online, but on mobile devices and all over the place. And so I thought that was an interesting term, the neo-network era. He says, in the classroom, we might benefit from incorporating our own versions of randomness and flexibility in order to meet students where they live, and to reflect the reality of what the neo-network era offers and demands from viewers. He also says, at a time when the flow of programming has become a torrent, and when the institutions that control and distribute most of these images are expanding and consolidating, it is vital that we equip students with the tools they need to make sense of the present moment in historical and critical terms. So what the students are seeing is they're seeing a flood, a torrent of all these things coming at them from all different directions, but what they might not understand is there's really only a few small powers that be that are controlling this stuff, and it's really important they understand the economics and the politics of that. So Freire would definitely agree, because he's very in on making sure that we're not letting things get ahead of what we really need them to be and what is safe for society, or what is recommended, I guess, for society. Because he says, the important thing from the point of view of libertarian education is for the people to come to feel like masters of their thinking, by discussing the thinking and views of the world explicitly or implicitly manifest in their own suggestions and those of their comrades. That's a really kind of expanded way of saying that it's really important for students to be able to take what they are experiencing, bring it into the classroom, and make sure that they are able to discuss it in a way that makes sense to them and to those people around them. And it fits in with what we've talked about historically with television and where we think it needs to go. So this is not only important in the classroom as we define and explore the neo-network era, but as we explore the pitfalls of conglomeration, expansion, and the deceptively free market of American media. Again, it seems like there's just no holds barred, there's no rules going on, but there really is a lot of control and thought manipulation that needs to be addressed, and make sure that students are aware of it. Right on, Freire would say. So another article I read, which was funny because I read it almost the day after I read this other article, and it just set off a lot of light bulbs for me in relation to the previous article, is an article by Jeff Selingo, who used to be the editor of the Chronicle of Education, Higher Education. He still writes for them. He still writes for the Washington Post. He wrote an article called Wanted in College Graduates, Tolerance for Ambiguity. So that really kind of fell on the coattails of the previous article. And it ties directly to the article about using flexibility and randomness in teaching television. It ties to Freire's concept of preaching in the desert, because each moment in education is situational. You walk into the classroom every day and it's a new day, and the students have new things going on in their lives. Especially in television, they've got new experiences to talk about. And so if you just preach the same old stuff, if I just sit there and talk about my television experience as a kid, it's not really going to mean a whole lot right there in the moment. I think it's important to do that, but I also think we need to get the students involved. So when I think about Freire's generative themes. And this whole section of the book was really tough for me to read, and I read it several times, but I really like it, and I really think he's getting at some deeper things here. And he talks about concentric circles, and he talks about limit situations, which I think are fascinating. And so I think that relates to what Jeff Salingo was saying. The ability to tolerate ambiguity on the job requires people to think contextually, what I call the connective tissue that occupies the space in between ideas. I wanted to make concentric circles here on the PowerPoint, but I didn't know how to do that. So if you can imagine a ripple effect of concentric circles and going from the abstract to the specific, I think it's important to make sure that students really understand how to think that way. To think in abstract terms is totally fine, and that's what they do a lot anyway, but be able to really specify and get specific with those ideas as they relate to things. You know, they might have just watched a really funny cat video on YouTube, but what is the abstraction of that? What, you know, when we talk about Minneapolis has a cat film festival happening this year at a baseball field where people get together on the lawn. Thousands and thousands of people come to watch YouTube cat videos. To me, that might be just a fleeting thing in their day when they hear about it, but that's a really interesting theme, a generative theme that says something about our culture, and it says something about the technology and the way we are reaching out through YouTube. And so anyway, that's kind of what made me think of that. So again, with the generative themes, Freire says, I'm going to try to pronounce this word right, when carried out with the methodology of conscientiac, I don't know how to say that, the investigation of the generative theme contained in the minimum thematic universe thus introduces or begins to introduce women and men to a critical form of thinking about their world. That word in italics there means a deeper awareness of the attitudes of their thinking. It's kind of like metacognition, really getting to think about, why am I sitting here in this field with thousands of people watching cat videos? What does this really mean about conglomeration? What does this have to do with the networks? What does this have to do with my personal level of storytelling? All of those kinds of things. So, find the story. That sounds like a really simple assignment. It's an ambiguous assignment. Jeff Salingo, his article was based on an experience he had as a journalist where his first job was dropped off in the middle of a city that he'd never been to, and the editor said, find a story. In the humanities, I think that's an incredibly powerful assignment. Because it's really not that ambiguous if you break it down. Because to me, if you think about concentric circles, television means literally sight from far away. All communication is telling stories in some form. So decoding, which Freire talks a lot about, decoding the story into moments of personal connection, societal impact, etc., is the essence of the arts and humanities. So when I teach television, when I teach theater, when I teach film, I'm always saying, what is the story here? How does this relate to the human primal need to tell stories? And from there, we can pretty much launch all of the specific things that get us into the middle of that concentric circle. Okay, so I'm hoping this is making sense. So again, with his generative themes, Freire says, authentic thinking, thinking that is concerned about reality, does not take place in ivory tower isolation, but only in communication. Okay, so that ambiguousness and how to make it more specific. Now what I'm really getting into in my project is thinking about active and cooperative learning projects I can do in the classroom. I read this book called Cooperative Learning, David Johnson and Roger Johnson and Carl Smith. A lot of you guys have talked about the Johnson & Johnson brothers, which I didn't know anything about until I took this class, so I was very excited to read this book. I have several books by them I haven't got to yet. One of the first things they say, grades in school do not predict success in a career or a higher quality of life, they say later on in the paragraph. Social skills do. And I think we all know this, but this is a very powerful, impactful, simple way to say it. You know what? We need to stop worrying about grades so much, but really making sure the students understand it, and maybe the grades will reflect that, if anything. Something I thought about, this is a side note, is that when my kids bring home report cards from school, 1st, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, they have lots of different categories that talk about their social skills. How well are they getting along with others? How well are they listening? Are they turning things in on time? Are they really doing higher level thinking? And it's interesting that that goes away. It just gets reduced to a letter grade. So there's a huge long report card with like 25 different categories when they're little, but those get broken down. And so where does all that information go? I think that's an interesting question. So anyway, active and cooperative learning, group activities that are discussed at length in this book, and there's a lot more details, but to summarize some of the main ones that I would like to start using groups to do these things: prepare for and review tests, check homework before submitting it, structured controversies. I can't remember who, I think it was maybe Darcy or Susan that posted this, but structured controversies where they talk about giving the students a specific question, like, you know, is censorship important? And then having 2 of them say yes and 2 of them say no, and then they have to switch which answer they have and fight for it. And then by the end of the day, all the students have to agree. I think that's a fabulous exercise. I'm going to use it all the time. The reading pairs, I think somebody mentioned this too, the murder method: mood, understanding, recalling, digesting, expanding, and reviewing as they read in pairs. Class presentations, I do a lot of that already. Drill, review pairs. So I'm going to create a curriculum for the fall that incorporates a lot of these things. A final article I read was on group exams, which is something I'm also very intrigued by. So the article was called Assessing and Refining Group Take-Home Exams as Authentic, Effective Learning Experiences. This particular article evaluates a study from a Science as a Way of Knowing course, where they actually had over 5 semesters, they studied the fact that they had specific group exams throughout the semester, and so they gave a lot of details, but basically I'll break it down. They had 3 to 5 member groups. They used open-ended, rigorous questions based on research article reading. So it wasn't just true-false questions, it was very open-ended, based on articles that were academic research. They had 7 to 10 days to submit it, but they did have to submit a draft after 7 days. There was a follow-up exam that was individually taken, so the students were graded individually, and depending on how well they did in their groups and how much effort they put in, that would be reflected in their final exam. There was a dissension form if they wanted to disagree with the group consensus answer that was submitted. Interestingly enough, this was never used. The students never, in 5 semesters, decided to disagree with their group members, which I thought was interesting. So in summary, how I'm going to relate this to my television projects. Because in this book they say, cooperative learning tends to promote greater cognitive and affective perspective taking than do competitive or individualistic learning experiences. So one example that I thought of in my show project, which I mentioned in my last presentation, where students study a particular show, instead of just presenting their information to the whole class for no reason, each student then presents their show to a panel of executives. So within the class there would be a group that, just answer it, a group that listens to them specifically and has specific things they're listening for. They are going to decide the fate of the show. The panel will then give specific criteria as to how the show may remain in production and how it will be distributed. So because of that assignment, in the groups, the students are going to study the current industry trends of viewership and distribution. Then they make up that panel of executives that know all of that and understand it. Individually, each student in the class studies a specific show's production style and theory and presents it to that group that has been studying the industry. So I think that's going to be an interesting way. I'm going to figure out how to do that. The final thing I want to share with you comes from Albert Einstein, not somebody that we've been reading, but somebody I love. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. So that's my presentation. Thanks for listening.